Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff, and today we're talking about part 8 of our Code Along series for Swatchity, messaging. As you can probably tell, messaging is a very important part of any social media site, and today we're going to be adding a couple of new pages, some API routes, and some server-side functions to make that feature a reality. So what is Swatchity? Click on the link on the upper right and you'll learn more. Let's take a look at the user story. When a user is logged in, they can message a user with a color by clicking through a button on that user's profile, accessible by clicking their avatar. Once a conversation is started, the user can reply to a thread of messages. The messages page holds a list of users they have conversations with, basically a list of threads. They can click through on a thread to view that thread of conversation. So let's take a look at how this works in production. We can click through on a user, and in their profile block, you see that reusable profile block, I said it was coming back. You can click on their message button to start a conversation if it doesn't already exist, or we can simply go to that conversation. We can click on our messages item here. We would see, if we had new messages, we would see a little dot here, and that works exactly like it does with alerts. So the user Swatchity has messaged us, so we can click through on that, and you see now we have a conversation, right? It's not back and forth and back and forth. It's a whole bunch from one user and a whole bunch from another, but you can see here we have the ones that are from me are on the right side, they're flush right, and the ones from the other user are flush left. That's basically how that works, and we can load more just like anything else. We can refresh just like we've done before. If I want to add a new one, we're going to add this kind of orangey red, and there it is, right? We've sent them a message, and on their end they'll get a little dot. So that's how it works in the application. Let's take a look at the code. So let's take a look at our schema here, and we can see we have message as well as message thread. So originally I just wanted message. I figured we could use a fairly complicated query to derive a list of users with whom we're having conversations, right? But the more I worked on it, the more I looked at it, it was a fairly heavy query, and it made sense at a certain point to just create a new data type called message thread. Those could be managed fairly easily and would result in much lighter queries. So as you can see, we have a to user and a from user. And in the code, when we're doing searching, we're using an or here. So we're saying, is my user in the to or the from, right? And the same up here. So again, we don't have an is red flag because we don't currently need that. Although looking at it now, I can see messages having a slightly different use case where maybe is red makes sense, at least at the thread level. But maybe that's an idea for down the road. Let's take a look at the message thread page. That's the index in our messages. So pages, messages, index. So this is the page that shows us our threads, our message threads. So very similar pattern to what you've seen before. We grab that server-side session and we pass it to a function called get message threads. Get message threads is going to look up the user based on the session. And then we're going to look for any thread where this user is either the to or the from, right? And then we're going to return it. So we get that, we get the message threads, and we pass that as a prop into our page, right? So message thread is its own type. Again, that's derived for us from our schema. Prisma does that work for us. Thank you, Prisma. So we have our threads here. We have our return here where we're wrapping in our layout. We have our message if you're not logged in. We map through our threads array here. The message thread list item is really simple. It's just the same kind of pattern we've seen before. We use the time since the last time the thread was modified. And it's just a basic rounded block with a link to the actual thread. So it's not really worth getting into in any detail. So in this use effect, this is exactly what we do in our alerts page, right? It's the same pattern. We're checking our local storage, last messages view, when the page loads, right? And then when we unload the page, when we click on another page, we set last messages view to the current date. And then if we click through one of these message thread list items, as we said, there's a link to the thread page. The thread page itself is right here under pages, messages, again, brackets ID. What is brackets ID? That's our parameter that we grab from context query, right? We've seen that before. We get the session, pass that into get messages DB, along with the ID of the other user, and 0 as our skip. That skip lets you know that we have load more pagination, which we'll look at in a minute. But get messages DB is right here, right? So we grab the session, we figure out who the user is, we figure out who the other user is based on the ID that we were provided. We pull in all of the messages between the two users indicated, right? The from user and the to user. We pack an object of the other user's profile, and we send both of those items back to the page, right? We serialize our message dates to avoid issues when we pass it through. Then we pass those items as props. So here's our refresh, load more, and load, which we've seen 1,000 times before. We're not going to get into that. You can look at those other sessions for more information on that. In our header buttons, we have our refresh. We don't need to put the new message button up here the way we have new swatch in other places or new reply, because the new message button, as we talked about, is already right here in this reusable user profile block. If we're not logged in, then we tell them, hey, you're not logged in, right? We wrap it in a layout. We just say, hey, there's nothing you can see here. We use our reusable user profile block. We tell the block that we're in messages mode, and we've already seen that component, so we're not going to go over that in any detail. Is creating, we run our skeleton at the top, right? If we're creating a new message, because it would be displayed at the top. But if we're loading, we would display a skeleton at the bottom below the list of posts, right? That makes sense. If we don't have any more messages, or we can load more, that stuff. These are all patterns we use on other pages, so it should be not a big deal. Just like many of our other pages, we're using a function, in this case called get messages, but it calls that API route. So from the front end, we can grab read messages, right? The read messages API route. And you'll see it uses that same get messages DB function that we were looking at earlier, right? So again, we're able to use it on the front end of the back end. So the rest of that is more or less boilerplate. It matches the other patterns that we're using. So that is how all of that works. So we've added some new tests. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. If you have other ideas for how to make tests run faster, more efficient, or make those tests more meaningful, let's have that conversation in the comments. I really want to talk about that. I enjoy writing tests. Some people do Sudoku, some people do crosswords. Sometimes for fun, I will write unit tests on a Saturday night, because that's the kind of nerd I am. That is more or less how this feature operates. Our next session is going to be all about the content management system that's used for our news page. So on our news page, we have all these stories. We're going to talk about not only how we display these and where that code comes from, we're also going to be talking about the admin panels that allow us to create this content. So look forward to talking about that, and see you then.